You don't need to be the best lawyer in the world. You just need to be a hard-working lawyer.
Welcome to Behind the Screens, Conversations with Background Screening Pros. I'm Les Rosen, your host, and I'm excited to have you here. On this podcast, we chat with the people who know the background screening world inside and out. Executives, industry experts, legal pros, and more. We dive into their personal stories and insights to give you a real look at what's happening behind the scenes. Whether you work in the screening industry or are just curious, Behind the Screens bring you the real, unfiltered conversations from the people who make it all happen. Stick around for stories you won't hear anywhere else. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Behind the Screens, Conversations with Background Screening Pros. Now, for folks that got in the industry somewhat recently, maybe the last 10 or 15 years or 5 years, whatever it was, it's something that you should know that there is a lawyer who has been in the screening industry since 1981. Mr. Larry Henry, in fact, as we'll discuss, was the very first lawyer that was dedicated to the practice and the focus of defending CRAs and working with the FCRA starting back in 1981. In fact, when I entered the industry more or less as a retirement career, 97, 98-ish or so, Larry had already been a practicing CRA lawyer for 16, 17 years. So it's such an honor and a pleasure to present on today's broadcast not only veteran of the screening industry, but superstar attorney who has done so much for the industry. He was a member of the first board of directors of PBS, now PBSA. He has represented so many screening firms. He still is doing the CRA help desk and answering legal questions for the background buzz. He co-authored one of the editions of the Criminal Record Handbook. He's a presenter and an exhibitor, and the list goes on and on. Don't want to embarrass our guest, but it's just a real honor to have Mr. Larry Henry. Larry, welcome to this podcast.
I'm glad to have you. Can be here.
So, Larry, let's start for people who may not be totally aware of the tremendous role that you have in the screening industry and the impact that you not only have, but you continue to have. What's your current role? What are you currently doing?
So I'm still practicing pretty much everything I've always done, just with you advice to my clients on compliance. I joke that we're, forms are us. We probably have a couple hundred forms for business and compliance that people can get at a reasonable price for just thousands of dollars that they can get elsewhere. And then if the lawsuit is local, I've got some that people decide to sue somebody in Oklahoma, so I can handle those. I don't travel around the country anymore like I used to. I literally got to the point once sitting in Detroit wondering if I was really coming or going. I had to sit there for a few seconds to figure out how I was going home. And my wife was pleased and said, well, maybe I won't do that anymore. But I do assist local law firms on interpretation of the FCRA, and so they'll write their briefs on those sections, and that helps a lot. So still here kicking, enjoy doing it. I kind of feel somewhat trapped having the help desk is, somebody's got to keep there helping people. So, that's what I'm doing.
That's fantastic. And let's just take a quick diversion. I want to unpack some of that. Tell us about the CRA help desk for those who haven't seen it. I think everyone has, but what that's all about.
Well, what I wanted to do was to create a help guide that was geared to lay people, not to lawyers. And knowing, in my experience, is most of the questions were, I need to know something before I can do a report. So, short time, want to know a yes or no. And so I designed it that way. So it's kind of, click and point a couple of times, and you can try to get to the question that you have. And people tell me, that's the way it works. They really like that. There were some out before that, but they were written by lawyers for lawyers, and that my clients would copy off some pages of that, send it to me and say, Larry, what does this say? So I determined that was not very helpful. So,
and part of the magic of the CRA help desk is it's state by state. So you can look up any state rules. And of course, there's the issue of whose law applies anyway. That's not a lot of fun, but fantastic resource. And it's incredible because these days now, the screening industry has grown to the fact that lots of major law firms now have entire sections and groups that are dedicated towards privacy in the FCRA. And people don't remember that there was a long period of time when there was only one FCRA lawyer in town, and that was Larry Henry. That was you, right?
Well, kind of get there by accident.
All right. Well, let's talk about how you got there. Tell us about your career path. How did a nice guy like you, I've known you for a long time, you're a gentleman and one of the nicest people I know. How did you possibly end up in background screening? What did you do wrong?
Well, it is kind of interesting. Sometimes it makes you think, God had a plan for you. Okay. So attending law school at University of Iowa, I wanted to be a tax lawyer. They were heavy in tax there. Got equivalent of a master's degree in taxation. They didn't do that. That's how I rolled in there. But then the Vietnam War was going on. I then went into the JAG Corps because I was going to have to go in. I was then in the Army for 4 years. And at that time, I did at Fort Dix, New Jersey, representing soldiers in the civilian courts in New Jersey. They had a test program. So I was in the court all the time. I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I was then a criminal defense lawyer for court martials, handled over 2,000 cases in 2 years. You can see what face that was. And then I went back home out of the Army, and I got a job as a tax lawyer. And I found that, that was not near as exciting as being in the courtroom. And so we came back to Oklahoma, and as it is in the industry, even though you don't want to do something, but if you've done it before and you get to the new firm, they say, oh, you've done that before, So, I handled was one of the defense counsel, one of the biggest at the time, securities fraud case in the country, and then other, white collar crime. Then that firm dissolved, and I went to another firm who needed a litigator. And then that firm decided that their employment section wasn't doing very well. They were losing all their cases. And so they turned to me and said, could you take over the employment section? I said, well, of course. And I did a rush job on learning EEOC law and all that stuff. And then after that, we never lost a case. So then sometime in August of 1981, my boss came to me and said, no, Charles Dees is going to come here. He's bought a new company, and he wants to talk to you about something in dealing with truck drivers. So I met with him, and he had bought the name, basically, of Drive-A-Check. It came D&EC services. And he was going to create a system where truck drivers' background could be obtained quickly. And my boss said, well, that sounds like employment, so you take care of him. And
so this was Charles Dees, founder of DAC?
Yes. And so I did that. Oh, that was 81. Sometime into the early 2000s. They went through multiple ownerships. Yeah, I knew at some time one of these New York City, investment firms who thought, who wants to talk to lawyers in Oklahoma? They don't do anything out there. And so I made, plans to expand to, other, CRAs and so forth. And so I did that. And my background in employment and criminal law is a great background in background screening, because I know how the courts work, I know the language, I do employment laws, discrimination. So I'm really a perfect background. It's kind of like somebody set me down this track. So at this point in 1981, I would have the qualifications to do that job. And so that's how I got there. And I think somehow I'm supposed to be there.
That's a fantastic career journey. So just your boss says, hey, this guy has something that sounds like employment, and boom, you're the first lawyer that specializes in the FCRA and the first lawyer who represents background firms.
So, in 1981, this is my level of employment. This is my level of CRA. And then over the years, it's just from there.
Okay. So one of the things that I think people may not remember that, the FCRA was amended in 1996, effective 97. And back in 96, there was a rule that said a criminal conviction cannot be reported past 7 years. which is now no longer the law. What was the story behind that?
Okay, this, again, of my involvement for DAC services, the tipping point was a truck driver who was entering Canada, and Canada would check people's criminal records as they came in, and the law out there stated that anyone who committed a serious offense, undefined, would be turned away. So at that point, a truck was entering Canada, and they ran the check on the guy, and I thought the Mountie had a bad breakfast or a bad time with his wife in the morning, and decided that the DUI 24 years earlier was a serious crime of the night entry to this driver. So the truck was sitting there waiting to cross the border. Its employer was out of Arkansas. They had to fly a driver up there. And so the deal was, we need to be able to know the companies, all of the convictions that somebody might have over a period of time, to avoid that. They would still be hired, but just not on a route going to Canada. And so we needed that. What we pushed on sympathy was, the child care center needs to know the guy who was, in prison, 12 years ago for, raping children, it was 7 years. And what was really amazing back in that time, 98, the Democrats and Republicans worked together. I mean, we really didn't have any opposition. Everybody was really happy to help us. We got started because my wife was a really good friend of Senator Nichols' chief of staff here in Tulsa. And so I went in and talked to her, and she called Don, and he was happy to sponsor the legislation. And so we got that done. And also included, since we're talking, the 90s, where the computers weren't that very prevalent, to get it that truck driver did not have to come in personally to apply for a job. The 1996 amendments assumed that every person being hired came into the employer's office and filled out an application, and that just did not work. So that's still in there, that, if you're subject to Department of Transportation, you can do everything remotely.
That's so interesting. So to unpack that a little bit, so the truck driver exception, which was vital back then because people might be hired at truck stops or gas stations in the middle of nowhere, and they couldn't sign papers. And obviously now with smartphones and everything, that's kind of superfluous. But the real interesting thing, and I did not know this until you and I just talked, that the impetus behind doing away with the FCRA limitation on reporting criminal records, where previously it was a 7-year limitation, had nothing to do with trying to have a bigger look-back period or second chance or fair hiring. It had to do with truck drivers who go to Canada.
That was it, but, that was not very sympathetic, so that's why we talked about child care centers.
Right.
And most people were shocked that then currently could be the situation that we couldn't tell. An employer wouldn't know that they're hiring the world's worst person at their business.
Right, yeah. That's a fascinating bit of history. So, Larry, as you've been representing, so many CRAs through the years and have been involved in lawsuits all over the country, as you said, not so much now, but in the past, what's an early lesson that comes to mind that in your career that has stuck with you today that you like to share that people might want to keep in mind?
Not so much a secret in the fact that you don't need to be the best lawyer in the world. You just need to be a hard-working lawyer. And what I did when I was a military lawyer, crime is broken down into elements. And a prosecutor must prove all the elements with that crime. Intent would be one of them, and there are various things. And what I learned there was I concentrated on the element they could not prove. I didn't care about the rest of the case. I just did that. And as a result, I ended up with that 85% kind of dismissal rate in a system that had a 99% conviction rate.
Wait, let that sink in. You had an 85% acquittal rate, whereas overall it was a 99% conviction rate.
Right.
I mean, that's amazing.
I think they're glad to see me lead.
All right. But the lesson is well taken, that you don't have to necessarily, be the best or be superior. But if you're the hardest worker, you'll get there.
Yeah. In this case, earlier on, the plaintiffs, lawyers who sued the FCRA really knew nothing about the FCRA. There was a famous lawyer to me in California that, start litigating as he read one section at a time of the FCRA.
Right. So,
And, then later on he'd read another section and file suits on that. But they were not very knowledgeable. The claim they were not very good. Or, you just had good defenses. I mean, it used to be, back in the day, that if you told a claims lawyer that your client's accuracy rate was 99.6%, and since the FCRA did not require perfection, that's reasonable. I said, I think anybody would agree that 99.6% accuracy is reasonable. And they would just go with. I mean, if they had...
Yeah, it's a different world today.
No, I mean, it wouldn't matter what they... If you had, in fact, I had one client that, you go through stuff, it was 99.99996%. I mean, and just like, and I never had a case, I think it was in Kentucky, where this lady had done this work for 25 years, never made a mistake, and made one.
Wow.
She quit because she couldn't accept the
yeah.
fact that she could make a mistake. And, to me, that more than meets the requirements of the FCRA. And I think the worst thing has happened, not just for, our cases, but generally speaking in the federal court. It used to be, I say, go back 35, 40 years ago, and maybe even 25 years ago, the judges in the federal court actively involved in their cases. You'd file a case, they'd have a meeting with counsel right off. And I mean, it was a pointed meeting. It wasn't, hi, how are you? It said, okay, why are you suing these people? What's your evidence? And turn to the defendants and say, what's your evidence? And, not so often you would have a judge look at the claim and say, you can't do that. That's not a claim. Or he'll turn to the defendant and say, no. I mean, I had one defendant where the judge got up in his library, pulled down a book, opened to a page, and lay it down in front of the defendant's lawyer. Read this right here. You can't do that. Pay him the money. That was the end of the case. Now, you may not see the judge until the trial starts. The cases are processed. They're not handled. They're just processed from A to Z. And, unscrupulous attorneys that just bring cases that don't care if they have any merit. They can string this out for a lot of attorney's fees. And, the courts are so automatic and just, okay, well, whatever your hours are and whatever we think the result rate is, we'll pay you. So if you get a $5 award and we get, $500,000 in attorney's fees, and that makes no sense.
That's the world we live in. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the changes and challenges, but I think you just talked about some of the biggest changes that you've seen in your career, the way that litigation has
like in
blossomed.
insurance, the availability of insurance, which everybody wants insurance, of course, it's kind of like, student loans and the cost of college education. The more or less it costs you, the more it costs you, your loans. And that now, it used to be, at DAC, there's no configured insurance. That, and if the case didn't have merit, we just told people to go pound sand. And we never lost a case. But, we said it had any merit at all. But also, you'd have people that contact us up and say, hey, this wasn't right, and you correct in the week. I lost, $215 last week. Can you pay me that? And we say, yeah. I had a little short, not quite a one-page release, but you would be tempted to go to a lawyer, have them read it, and some wanted to criticize that by saying, well, there are, 14 different exceptions that he might have. Yeah, well, probably not, in reality. So we used to do, those kind of things, man. I'll just tell you my funniest dispute, okay? Out of Florida, a guy was going to work for Kurtz. And I get this letter from this lawyer saying, the report was wrong. This was his job of a lifetime. And he didn't get it, and just went on like this is the biggest crushing event in this fellow's life. And I, looked at the timetable of when the report went out, and when they notified, the applicant he wasn't going to get the job. And then when I got this letter, and I was thinking, this doesn't add up, because if this was really his dream job, he wouldn't wait 3 months to go talk to a lawyer. So I said, he went to the lawyer. The lawyer put it on his desk. He did nothing for a couple months. And we also found out the person held the job open for 45 days for him. So if he got written a letter, they would change the report in time. He had his dream job. So I wrote this letter saying, hey, here's really why what we did was really okay, not really a violation. That, oh no, and I said, we'll pay, and I think it was like $500 and some odd dollars. So I get this letter back, just as vicious a letter you could ever read about how awful I was, how awful my client was, how unfair and unreasonable this offer was. It went on for 3 pages, single-spaced. Okay. And about halfway through the second page, I got tired of being insulted. So I said, what's the end? He says, we'll accept your offer. And so I says, I was right. It's set there on your desk. It was your fault. And you don't want your client to find out.
That's right. So he sat on the case past the time where rehearsal open. That's quite a story. So, Larry, you kind of got into the screening industry by whatever in '81. You've stayed in it all these years. I know you do other things as well, but you do just a ton of FCRA screening work. What attracts you to the screening industry? What do you like about it that keeps you going in it?
I just think it's a very important business. I mean, it's critical. Now, a lot of people run around and think nobody should know about anything about a person's criminal background because they've satisfied their debt to society. Then they don't understand that, the criminal personality. And so I think it's important, but I also think it's important to have somebody, and I was this way in employment, that if the employer was doing it right and doing it justice, you weren't a physically accurate advocate for the employee, but you made sure the employee was treated fairly. And so in other words, I say more employment than plaintiff employment lawyers did. So it was, I felt that was important. It gave me satisfaction. And the background screening is important that the companies do it correctly. And it's important to be fair to the consumers. I mean, things I draft up and how I draft them up that got to be seen by the consumer. I put myself in their position of, how much stuff do I look at before I read nothing? Some of these people put out disclosures or other documents, and then I saw one that ran 17 pages. I thought, well, maybe this was their point was, I guarantee you no consumer read that. Or if you ran across one that read every word, you probably didn't want to hire that person. But, it just, so you work hard to get things down to as short as you can legally get it. And, that's clear to the consumer, then also from the stand of if you're in the courtroom, it's clear to the judge. These judges see all kinds of things. They're not experts in the FCRA. And, sometimes you hear some, kind of funny comments. It's like, the world doesn't work that way. It's like, I had to tell a judge once, it really doesn't matter if you don't understand this report. You are not a user of this report. But you understand it. And that's kind of offensive to the judge because they think they understand everything. But it's something that you have to make clear is that, if the employers understand this report, it doesn't mean what the plaintiff's lawyers think it means. The credit bureaus have the same thing. They have the kind of little codes and how they put things down. And you're always getting, people, that's misleading. And it's like they keep finding these lawsuits over the same issue year after year, and they lose year after year. Don't you ever read these cases knowing that this is not a winning argument? I guess not.
I guess not. Right. So, that's a great approach. That what you do is important not only for the CRAs and for employers, but also treating the applicant fair so that they know what they're getting into, and employers understand fair chance and second chance hiring and everything they need to do under the EOC. So that's a great approach.
Well, I know dealing with, PBSA, members is they're all very much committed to being fair to consumers. Right. And I've always been impressed by how, as a group, how professional they are and how, serious they are about their business. The plaintiff lawyers don't think that at all, of course. That, they just get up in the morning and say, how many people can I not keep from getting a job today? And I keep score, that kind of a thing. But I've always found them that, they're serious. Now, sometimes, the serious thing, I'm really compliant, and not so much, their mind they are, but they didn't take the time to, find out now. That's one thing. Well, if I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma, legal fees are much lower in Tulsa, Oklahoma than they are in Chicago, Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles. And so I tried to make that kind of stuff affordable.
And that's a really great observation. I think sometimes people outside the industry don't get that those of us who are in the industry really do care about, really do consider applicants to be our clients, even though they don't pay us, the employer pays us. I agree with you. There is a real dedication, commitment, and understanding that everyone needs to be treated fairly. Records need to be accurate, need to be relevant, recent, fair, that people aren't unduly hindered by an old conviction that may not have any relevance anymore, and all those things. That's a great approach. So I think we may have covered this, but is there a moment, in a long and illustrious career, a career, by the way, that's still going strong, so I'm not suggesting otherwise, something that you look back on that is an accomplishment that kind of brings a smile to your face when you think about it, or something you say, yeah, that was a good one?
No, yeah, I mean, I think greatest accomplishment in that was defending the class action by the owner-operators association against DAC services. They hated the DAC report. They wanted it to go away. DAC became a verb, too. It was so prevalent. It was, I've been DAC'd. Somebody was a bad driver, and, they got the report, and they've been DAC'd. And so they filed a class action. They'd been planning that for years to file a class action. And this happened right after, I think, DAC sold to the first investment group, and they had a new guy in, and he said, well, what about settling? I said, this is not about settling with, this is about destroying us. I said, really? I said, yeah, this is, Israel and the Palestine, people. That's what this is. And he said, okay. And I remember we went to a settlement conference, had a magistrate judge do that. And they always kind of go through this rigmarole saying, no, you're here for resolve things. Everything's uncertain, if you will, the trial, and really cases about money. So, in terms of plans, what kind of money we're talking about? And I said, we really don't care about money. We want to destroy the defendant business. And he said, wow, that makes it kind of hard to settle then.
That makes it hard to settle.
And 3-week trial, and the jury came back in 2.5 hours. 1 hour at least was for lunch with a defendant's verdict that dismissed all of the claims, and the big Washington, D.C. law firm was just shocked that could happen to him. And we knew it when a jury was picked that we were going to win. We picked the great jury. It was just super. Yeah. We had one lady, I wasn't going to be on there, but she owned a small trucking company. And so I asked her, what do you go through when you hire a driver? And it's important to have, a history of employment history and all that stuff. And I mean, she just educated the jurors like crazy.
Well, did she remain a juror?
Oh, no, she her.
Oh, yeah, she was. She was. There was a preemptory issued, obviously, on that part. Okay, so those were the days.
They heard it all. They heard it all.
Yeah, we can do voir dire and use that as a tool to educate. Yeah, not so much anymore.
It was fun. Every day in court was fun. Their witnesses were terrible. Ours were great. So
and that was a decisive win because they were trying to basically say you can't do background checks on drivers. You can't have driving records.
The format we did, it was not accurate. It was an outline.
Okay.
We had a witness that was a DOT inspector for 25 years or something like that. He was a consultant by the time we got him. He was really personable and the hospital guy. And he said, look, reviewed thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of driver qualification files that have DAC reports in them. And as DAC says, the people go through and they call, and then they make notes by all the entries that are on the DAC report. They just don't use the DAC report. They use it as the kind of outline of when they go to the other, employer. And that's how we asserted that was the whole basis of how that report was used. And they would fill in any facts that they thought were important to them. And he was great. The jury just loved him to death.
That's interesting. It says, and basically a real seminal case that enabled that type of report to continue to exist.
And again, to the judge, it doesn't matter that it looks strange to you. You have to ask the users.
Yeah.
And of course, then the plaintiffs never brought any users who were confused.
I love your comment, by the way, 2.5 hours, including lunch. I've also tried hundreds of jury trials. I've never had a jury come back just before lunch. Doesn't happen.
They got their lunch. They came back after lunch.
The jury's always going to get us lunch.
Yeah.
Right.
Had one trial, they had to have their donuts in the morning before they came back with their verdict. They sent the note down saying, "Where are our donuts?"
Where were the donuts? And we'll give you a verdict in exchange for donuts.
Yes, that was about it.
Verdicts for donuts. So, Larry, that one of the things that brings us up to is your role in the initial formation of PBSA, then NAPBS, and you were a member of the initial board of directors.
I was, and that was Derek Hinton that nominated me for that, friend of both of us. And I think part of this got going is in about 2000, 2001 in California doing some crazy things with their background screening laws. And
Right.
I think like in 28, the damages minimum was like $25,000. And I was doing research on, you can't have a civil penalty so hard that it's, awful. And then next year they lowered it to 10,000. And I suggested Derek, why don't you go to your trade crew to get together to, fight this stuff? And he says, we don't have one. I said, well, you guys better get together and get one. Yeah.
Well, I remember those days. I was the guy.
People, but it was shortly after that.
Yeah. I was the guy who went to California and actually rewrote that law. I remember sitting in the legislator's office with the legislative system. We just rewrote it line by line. And I was thinking, God, if we had a trade group, that would be really helpful.
Brilliant minds think alike, right?
Yeah. So, and there's, I think I mentioned this in another show, but there's that special California language that has to go on every report. That just came out of the top of my head one day. We were just sitting there writing language, and they had some horrible language. And I said, well, use this language instead. I just made something up. And the language I made up off the top of my head without any particular thinking going into it became the language that the entire industry now has to use. So it's, it's like that old joke. You don't want to, go to your favorite restaurant and actually watch them make the sausage, right? You don't want to know how laws are really made. Because you said when you were able to effectuate change in the FCRA, your wife knew someone who knew the senator, and you were able to get things started that way. It's just really interesting how life works.
Well, one thing I learned by doing the help desk is you may be upset with the quality of your state legislature. Yeah, it's about the same as everybody else's state legislature.
Right. That's right. And I remember in the early days of PBSA, MAPS, where there was really hard for me to be on was legislative affairs or governmental relations. And I remember every state would have dozens of crazy laws, and none of them stood a chance of getting passed, but you still had to be on top of all of them. So, those were some crazy times. So you were on the board, and I remember that. I was the chair of that first board, and you played such a big role. I was a lawyer at the time, but I was not a practicing lawyer. I didn't represent clients like you did. I had a business, but you were the only practicing lawyer on that board who could really give us free legal advice as to what to do. Right.
Yeah, we volunteered a lot of legal fees to get the place started and up and going, which we were pleased to do. So,
yeah, and thankfully you never billed any because you were on the board. We didn't have to hire you; we just elected you, and so didn't have to pay anything. And just to round out the PBSA discussion. I don't go as often now, but every PBS show I went to, you were there, and I have with me, I'm going to surprise you with this, but the best thing I've ever gotten at a trade show.
Larry I think it's great. I have them everywhere because they actually work.
And this one, you got to see this first. This one comes out, and you have a flat head, and there's two sizes. And then you put that back, and then you take out the other half, and there's a Phillips with two sizes. And I have one of these in every room in my house. Larry Henry, you live with me in every room in my house. Right.
Well, I got one here in my desk drawer. So.
I collect every trade show. And Larry, look over there. I grab a couple more. Right. That's the best thing I've ever seen at a trade show. I appreciate that.
Well, it's hard to get things that really work. And hard with Mike, I said I want the giveaways to be a tool because our tool website is a tool to help people. So
yeah, exactly.
That was one of the first ones I ran across, and then I thought, man, that is It's sturdy. It really works. And could give those away a couple times. So
So when you first did the CRA help desk, that was in connection with our good friend and companion, Mike Sankey, the founder of BRB, along with Carl Ernst. And then that has since moved, and you still maintain that help desk.
well, it was interesting getting it started because, Mike did books.
Yeah, right.
And Mike thought in terms of books. Okay. And I said, well, Mike, every time we get one of these out, it's obsolete when we give it to people. But if we had we sell for $25 until $25. I said, but if we had a website, we have an annual fee. And I think it was $129. And I suggested maybe I suggested $300. He was always cheap. So he said $120. He got to thinking about that as well. They buy $25 worth of merchandise from me every 5 years versus me getting $125 or so every year from them. And they finally, the light bulb went off that, that's better than a book.
So Mike opened his eyes and learned. Because you're right, the minute you write a book, it's outdated. The very second you print it, the next day it's outdated. All right, in this way, you do it online. You have it's a service model, so it's a subscription model. So that's a great story. All right, and I should also point out that over the years, on any number of occasions, you have been a presenter for PBSA, both educational webinars and at PSA conferences.
Well, you and I worked hard on getting the webinar started.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and it was in Austin, Texas, I remember.
That's right. That's right.
I remember a young lady came up to me and one of my partners and said, do you have service agreements? And I said, yes. He says, well, I just paid the lawyer $10,000 for them, and I don't think it's right. I told her, I said, well, I could have sold you up $250 at Walmart.
Right.
How's that making you feel bad,
But don't rub it in. I remember one time we had back-to-back presentations at PBSA, and I can't recall what mine was. Mine was on non-traditional background screenings. And I remember you were in the front row, and I kept looking at you saying, God, I hope I don't say anything Larry disagrees with. I hope I got it basically right. And you kept a poker face. It wasn't until afterwards you told me, you were basically right. All right. Not 100%, but close enough.
Well, yeah, close enough for government work.
Right. Because you were giving the next seminar on a related topic. Well, at any rate, listen, on my behalf, I have to thank you for serving that first board and for everything you've done for PBSA over the years in terms of presentations and working with firms and the help desk. And I think we mentioned that you were the co-author, I think, of the third edition of the criminal law, along with our good friend Derek Hinton, that you were a co-author in the third edition of that, of the Criminal Records Handbook. And I should say, and I wanted to thank you for that, and I think I have off tape, but you were a key person in when I wrote the Safe Hiring Manual in 2004, and then 2 or 3 editions later, because you took the time out to review it all for me, and you held your laughter to a minimum in the sections you thought where I got it wrong. I remember a couple of different cases where you said, no, that just isn't right. I said, I think it is. No, you said it isn't. And I finally said, all right, I'm going with Larry. That's what Larry said. All right. I think you and I were having, I just came to mind having discussions about what was the law in Nevada, the 7-year rule in Nevada or something or other. I had some theory about it, and you could hardly contain your laughter at my theory. But we finally came to an agreement on that.
That's probably because you've lived in California too long, It kind of affects the brain,
My brain had turned to mush. Well, let's get past the FCRA and PBSA, and we have a few minutes left. We bring it a little bit to a close here. But let's talk about life beyond screening. I'm looking at your office back there, and I see trains and keys, and there's a big knife, and all sorts of things. So tell us a little bit about what that's all about and life beyond background screening and being a lawyer.
Okay. Well, what you see on the wall is a little bit of this. See more. All railroad stuff. I was the 5th generation of my family that worked on the Chicago, Verona, and Quincy Railroad. That's how I got through college, working on that in the summers. And that's when college didn't cost that much. And you actually could, if you got a good job, you would pay for college. So,
And let me make sure I heard that right. You've been working on the railroad. It's like choo-choo trains
right,
and
choo-choo
railroad
trains
tracks.
for 5 summers. Learned how to work really hard. I was the only guy that didn't tan. Well, that being outside, I'd get a little tan on my back of my neck, but that was it. So I was always praised for that. I did that, but all these things remind me either what I saw, like you see the little choo-choos behind me, the red and the white ones, those are the ones you see go down the tracks when I was working, because I did the job. Either we were repairing the tracks or we were building the tracks. But one thing was everything was down there and everything was really heavy. Okay. And then I have things from my father. I have things from my grandfather. And so it's kind of a museum of the male side of, my family, what they did. So where my grandfather was killed on the railroad in a fire, and
Oh, sorry.
his watch that he had that still has the, black smudges on it, and that's framed up. So important to me. Yeah, I tell young people, sometimes they say, well, what do you do if you're office? I said, put something up that you like. I says, the diplomas aren't really very interesting, or admissions to court. If you like baseball, put baseball things up. If you like whatever, have that, because you can take a few seconds away from your work to look at that and you think about it, and that makes you feel good, and you come back and get to the more and work again. So, I worked on that. Not too many people work on the railroad. That knife, however, was handmade by shop foreman in Savannah, Illinois. I lived there when I was a baby, and he had made me a wheelbarrow. He had made me a sandbox that had a canvas top that would go down and close at night so the cats would stay out of the sandbox. He made Dad that night. It's out of stainless steel. It was out of a wreckage of a passenger train. He cut that out and cut it and formed it, and it's all one piece. There's no tang or anything going down the handle. It's all just one thing. I mean, it's a heavy dude and might be good to fight. I don't know, but that was kind of amazing. My folks used that, and I even put the history on the back of the frame so somebody would know about that. So, but enjoy that. It's good things when you're on there, especially when the kids in the summer. The game was when railroad cars went by and then had these initials, you have to guess what the name of the railroad was. So you got really good at, what the initials were. The Erie, Lackawanna, railroad, and, that had the route of the Phoebe Snow. I always thought that was pretty funny.
So Larry Henry, railroad aficionado, and I've been working on the railroad. All right. So I think that I usually ask about fun facts that you're a railroad guy.
Yeah, and I've always hoped to have a railroad layout, but I've never had time to do that.
Right. And to make a real bad joke, you're a railroad guy, but you've never been railroaded, so that's good. So, Larry, this has been great. We're approaching kind of the end mark here. And let's finish with where we always finish with these podcasts. I don't want to say you've been around a long time, but, as the first lawyer in the industry, and you've been going strong since 81, and I don't see any signs of you cutting back all that much. But what's your advice for newcomers to the industry, or people that are maybe starting their career or maybe been in it for a few years and trying to decide whether to stay in the industry and make a career of it? What's your take on that? What would you tell sort of a younger person?
I think the critical thing is to associate yourself with somebody who can advise you on compliance. I've said lots of people come to me, so I'm very compliant. I have compliance is number one. And you start going through their stuff, and it's just awful. And what they've done is they've gone on the internet and say, oh, here's an agreement, here's that, and I'll borrow that one. And they really don't know if it's good, bad, or indifferent, or it really applies to what they're doing. I had one guy out of San Francisco I talked to at that Austin meeting. I still remember him, that he needed to, get an agreement and so forth. And then I didn't hear from him. Oh, well, And then he calls me up. He says, well, I'm going to have to get that agreement from here because I went online and I found all these agreements, but they're all different and I don't know why. You're smart enough to know that, he didn't know, And so I think that's the thing is to get somebody who knows what they're doing, to shop around to somebody that's affordable. So, I think that's key because it give you a lot of peace of mind that you are doing it right. And you can't keep from being sued if you will just get sued for no reason whatsoever, really. It's fun on the litigation side when the other side are idiots, but it's not any fun on my client side because they're getting sued and they always have a deductible and they'd rather pay attention to making money rather than spending money on lawyers. So do the most you can to avoid that. Small CRAs usually avoid it for quite a while because they don't have very neat, head doesn't rise above the crowd, so, but, my philosophy is if you're first time you're sued and you're right, tell the pound sand because they don't want to come back. I've had that experience where, I had, general counsel and claim was totally worthless. It would claim, well, you said his truck rolled over. I said, I got fixed if his truck rolled up. Well, it didn't go 90 degrees. Well, it went as far as the ground was, and in 5 minutes, I had 2 experts who fixed it and said, yeah, that's a rollover. And general counsel, well, you never know. And he settled with them. And then they just stood in line, suing him over and over. And that was the Francis Mail firm. And I would, again, just told him pound sand. I told them on that twice, pound sand, and they never came back.
Right. And that's one of the things you're known for is you tell it like it is. You're practical. It's real world. It's the way it should be. And, you tell it like it is, as the old saying goes. Well, Larry, it's been great talking to you. Before we hang up and put this one in the books, let me just ask you give you the last word. Anything you wanted to add or to our discussion? The floor is yours.
I really don't. I just enjoy you. I've enjoyed knowing you all these years of fellow Coke drinkers, and everybody's having their beer, and you're over there for your Diet Coke, and I'm over there with my regular Coke. And so we're kindred spirits, okay?
And I appreciate that. And I've had to give up Diet Coke because for health reasons now it's like what's it called? There's a beverage called, I think they call it water. So I've been drinking that lately.
Here,
for a change
I'll
of
toast
pace.
You here with my glass of water.
All right. Thank you, Larry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been delightful. This has been to me, very special because Larry has not only been a friend and a colleague, but a mentor and one of the people in the industry that I look up to the most and I think has contributed beyond description, beyond anything I can even begin to mention or to think we can pay him back. And Larry, I appreciate our time together. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, that was yet another wonderful conversation with a background screening pro. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update. And hey, if you got a moment, we'd love for you to leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. For more info or to catch up on past episodes, or to make suggestions or to suggest possible future guests, head over to our website. Once again, this is your host, Les Rosen, and it's been a pleasure to bring you another episode. See you on the next episode. Thanks.